Memphis, Tennessee, 2009. Loretta Jameson had spent years fighting for survival. Her divorce had been brutal, leaving her with nothing but a small, run-down apartment, a string of exhausting, low-paying jobs, and a teenage daughter who had seen too much hardship too soon. She had spent years clawing her way through life, sacrificing sleep to make ends meet, rationing food when money ran short, and patching up her daughter's clothes instead of buying new ones. Every day felt like a battle she was destined to lose. Then she met Pastor Edward Hayes. To Loretta, he was a miracle. He was charismatic, respected, and deeply devoted to his congregation. Every Sunday, his sermons drew hundreds, filling the pews with people who clung to his every word. They called him a man of God, a leader with a pure heart. He had a way of speaking that made you believe in something bigger than yourself, made you feel seen, made you feel chosen. And for the first time in her life, Loretta felt chosen. When Edward proposed, she said yes without hesitation. Marriage to him meant a new beginning, not just for her, but for her 16-year-old daughter, Nia. It meant an end to the endless struggle, the sleepless nights spent worrying about bills, the uncertainty of whether she could afford next month's rent. It meant stability, safety, and finally, a place to belong. She moved into his home, leaving behind the cramped, dimly lit apartment with its peeling wallpaper and faulty heating. Edward's house was enormous in comparison, a pristine two-story home in an upscale neighborhood. The air inside smelled of polished wood and fresh linen, so unlike the musty scent of her old life. The church embraced her, treating her like a blessing to their beloved pastor. People smiled warmly, offered their congratulations, and told her how lucky she was. For the first time in years, she felt secure. Nia, however, remained withdrawn. She had never known a father figure, and Edward's presence unsettled her in ways she couldn't explain. She avoided eye contact with him, spoke only when necessary, and spent most of her time in her room. Loretta assured her that this was a good change, that they were finally safe. There would be no more worrying about rent, no more counting pennies for groceries, no more cold winters with a broken heater. This was their second chance. At first, life with Edward felt almost perfect. He was attentive, affectionate, and unfailingly kind in public. He praised Loretta during sermons, calling her his gift from God. At home, he made sure she had everything she needed, from elegant dresses for Sunday service to a new Bible inscribed with her name. He insisted on morning prayers as a family, on maintaining a household devoted to faith and purity. But beneath the surface, the warmth began to fade. It started with small things, subtle corrections, quiet reprimands when she spoke too casually to church members, disapproving glances when she didn't wear the modest clothing he preferred. He monitored her phone, questioned her about her whereabouts, and expected her to consult him before making any decisions, no matter how minor. If she hesitated, he reminded her that obedience was a virtue, that as a pastor's wife, she had a duty to reflect his values. Loretta told herself that this was normal, that he was simply a man of strong principles. But over time, his control tightened. He dictated what she should wear, what she should cook, and even which women in the church she should associate with. His voice, which in the church was calm and uplifting, became firm and cold at home. He expected silence when he spoke. Any disagreement, no matter how small, was met with a long, icy stare that made her feel small and foolish. When words were no longer enough, he used his hands. It was never in public, never in a way that left visible bruises. A tight grip on her wrist when she didn't move fast enough. A painful squeeze on her shoulder when she asked too many questions. A slap across the face when she dared to raise her voice. He never apologized, only reminded her of her role, of her responsibilities as his wife. Loretta learned to endure. She smiled in public, played the part of the devoted wife, and told herself that this was better than the life she had before. She prayed for strength, for patience, for the love she had once imagined this marriage would bring. But in the quiet of the night, lying beside the man she once thought would save her, she felt only fear. Months passed, and fear became Loretta's constant companion. She learned how to move through the house like a shadow, careful not to provoke Edward's temper. She spoke only when necessary, kept the house immaculate, and ensured that dinner was always ready at the precise time he expected. She had memorized the signs of his mood, the stiffness in his posture when something displeased him, the measured, deliberate way he set his Bible down when he was preparing to lecture her, the sharp exhale of breath before an outburst. She adapted, shaping herself into the obedient wife he demanded, hoping that if she did everything right, the storm would not come. But something shifted. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable, until it became impossible to ignore. Edward's attention had drifted from her and settled elsewhere, on Nia. Nia had always been quiet, reserved in a way that made her seem smaller than she was. She avoided large gatherings, preferring the solitude of books and sketching in her notebook. She rarely spoke unless spoken to, but despite her shyness, she had a warmth about her, a gentleness that made people trust her without question. At first, Edward's interest in her seemed paternal. He asked about her school, her favorite subjects, her future plans. He encouraged her to attend more church functions, to engage with the youth group, to take an active role in their spiritual home. He complimented her intelligence, her kindness, her ability to listen. Then, the gifts began. A new leather-bound journal, an expensive set of pens, a delicate gold necklace that looked too extravagant to be a casual gift. Loretta questioned it once, suggesting that such presents were unnecessary, but Edward dismissed her concerns with a simple wave of his hand. He was rewarding Nia's good behavior, he said. Encouraging her. Soon, Loretta noticed other changes. His eyes lingered too long when Nia entered a room. He found reasons to be near her, placing a hand on her shoulder under the guise of fatherly guidance, letting his fingers trail a moment too long. He started calling her into his study for private conversations, meetings that stretched longer each time. Nia changed too. She withdrew further, her usual quietness turning into something else, something darker. She no longer met Loretta's gaze at dinner. She flinched when Edward spoke her name. She spent more time locked in her room, her schoolwork becoming an excuse to avoid the shared spaces of the house. Loretta's concern grew, but she told herself that she was imagining things. She had to be. Edward was a pastor, a man of God. He was strict, yes, controlling, even cruel, but he would never cross that line. The city revered him, his congregation hung on his every word. How could someone like that be capable of such things? But then came the night Loretta could no longer ignore what was happening. She woke to the muffled sound of crying. The house was dark, silent except for the faint sobs that barely reached past the walls. At first, she thought it was a dream, but as she sat up, the sound sharpened. It was coming from Nia's room. Loretta moved quickly, her heart pounding as she reached the door. She turned the knob and stepped inside. Nia was curled in the corner of her bed, her knees drawn to her chest, shaking. Her face was hidden against her arms, but when she lifted her head, her eyes were wide with something more than sadness. It was terror. Loretta's breath caught in her throat. She didn't ask questions. She didn't need to. The answer was written all over her daughter's face. But fear was a powerful thing. It locked her voice in her throat, trapped her in place. She was afraid of what she already knew, afraid of confirming it, afraid of what Edward might do if she dared to confront him. The next morning, nothing was said. Edward greeted them both as usual, his voice even, his smile composed. Nia barely looked at him. Loretta watched her daughter from across the table, her hands trembling in her lap. She had married a man she thought would save them. Now, she realized, she had brought a monster into their home. Summer of 2010 arrived with an oppressive heat that clung to the air like a heavy shroud. The days stretched long and unbearable, yet inside the Hayes household, the atmosphere was even more suffocating. Loretta had begun to notice changes in Nia, subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. Her daughter, once so particular about her appearance, had abandoned the fitted jeans and bright-colored blouses she used to love. Instead, she wore baggy sweatshirts, loose t-shirts, anything that concealed her frame. Even in the sweltering heat, she kept her sleeves long, her body hidden. She avoided the sun, shrinking from its warmth as if it might expose something she was desperate to keep secret. Her appetite waned. Loretta watched night after night as untouched plates piled up, as meals turned cold before Nia would push them away. The soft fullness in her cheeks thinned, leaving behind hollow spaces that deepened the shadows under her eyes. She slept more, but it wasn't restful sleep. Loretta could hear the restless shifts of her body through the thin walls, the occasional whimper in the dead of night, the strangled sobs that Nia tried to bury under layers of blankets. Loretta told herself she was imagining things. She wanted to believe that Nia was just struggling with school, or maybe with adjusting to their life under Edward's rigid control. Teenage girls had their own burdens, their own battles that mothers couldn't always understand. But deep down, she knew this was something else. Then came the night when her worst fears took shape. Loretta had gone to bed early, exhausted from another long day of forcing herself to smile, of keeping her voice steady in Edward's presence. The house was silent except for the faint hum of the air conditioning, the occasional creak of wooden floors settling under the summer heat. She had just drifted into the fragile space between waking and sleep when a sound pulled her back. The unmistakable sound of quiet crying. Loretta sat up, her senses sharpening instantly. The noise was soft, but persistent, coming from the hallway bathroom. A chill prickled down her spine as she swung her legs over the edge of the bed and stepped onto the cool floor. She moved carefully, each step cautious as she approached the slightly ajar door. The light inside was on, casting a narrow sliver of yellow against the dark hallway. She pushed the door open. Nia stood in front of the mirror, her body rigid, her shoulders trembling. Her hands clutched a small white plastic stick against her stomach, her knuckles white from the pressure. Her breath came in shallow gasps, as though she couldn't pull in enough air. Loretta's eyes dropped to the object in her daughter's hands. A pregnancy test. 2 red lines. The world tilted. A rush of noise filled her ears, a roaring sound that drowned out every rational thought. Her body felt heavy, rooted to the cold tile floor beneath her feet. Nia finally turned, her face streaked with silent tears, her lips trembling. Loretta didn't need to ask. The answer was already there, written in the shattered look in her daughter's eyes, and the way she curled into herself as if trying to disappear. Edward. The name thundered in her mind, tearing through every defense she had built. Nia crumbled then, her body folding inward as sobs racked through her thin frame. She pressed her hands to her face, her breath coming in broken, desperate gulps, as though saying it out loud would make it worse. Loretta reached for her, but her arms felt foreign, disconnected from her body. Her fingers hovered in the air, uncertain. Something inside her snapped. Fear evaporated, burned away by something hotter, something raw and all-consuming. Rage. A kind of fury she had never known, a fire that filled the empty spaces where terror had once lived. It coiled in her stomach, curled its way up her throat, made her hands shake with the force of it. She had thought she was protecting her daughter. She had convinced herself that suffering in silence was better than risking the wrath of a man who held power over their lives. She had believed that submission would keep them safe. She had been wrong. She had not saved her daughter, she had led her straight into the hands of a monster. The house was quiet, save for the occasional creak of settling wood and the low hum of the ceiling fan. The air was thick with the weight of the night, heavy with an unspoken tension that had lingered for too long. Edward sat in the living room, his usual spot on the worn leather armchair, Bible open on his lap. The dim glow of the lamp cast long shadows across the room, illuminating his face in flickering patterns. His expression was calm, unbothered, as if the weight of the world had never touched him. He read in silence, lips moving slightly over familiar verses, fingers tracing the delicate pages like they held the key to his salvation. Loretta stood in the kitchen, her body motionless, her mind in chaos. The cool metal of the knife handle pressed against her palm, grounding her, anchoring her in the present. Her grip tightened. The blade felt heavier than it should, its edge gleaming under the fluorescent light. She could hear the rhythmic turn of pages in the next room, the sound steady, methodical. It was a ritual she had listened to countless nights, a sound that once soothed her. Now, it grated against her nerves. She focused on it, matching her breath to the pace of his movements, steadying herself. Her mind played images like an old film reel, flickering between memories. Their wedding day, the vows he spoke with such conviction, his hands warm as they held hers. The day they moved into this house, her heart full of hope, believing that love and faith would be enough. The nights she lay awake, listening to his measured breathing, wondering if the man beside her was the same one the church worshipped. The footsteps outside Nia's door. The hushed sobs muffled by blankets. The red lines on the pregnancy test. The betrayal etched into her daughter's hollow stare. Her heartbeat slowed, not with fear, but with certainty. She stepped forward, her bare feet silent against the hardwood floor. Each step felt lighter, as if a weight was being lifted with every movement. The distance between them grew smaller, and yet it felt infinite. The house seemed to stretch around her, the walls pressing inward, suffocating. Edward remained unaware, absorbed in his reading, his world untouched by the horror he had created. She stopped behind him. For a moment, she hesitated, watching the slow rise and fall of his chest. This was the man the city revered, the man who preached of righteousness and devotion, who stood before his congregation and spoke of faith and purity. This was the man who had stolen everything from her daughter. This was the man who had twisted scripture to fit his desires, who had turned a home into a prison. He lifted his head slightly, sensing her presence, but by the time his eyes met hers, it was too late. The knife drove into his chest, the blade sliding through flesh with sickening ease. His body jerked, a sharp, choked gasp escaping his lips as his hands flew to the wound. The Bible tumbled to the floor, pages bending as it landed in a growing pool of crimson. His breath came in ragged, desperate gulps, his fingers clawing at the handle protruding from his chest. Eyes wide with shock, he looked up at her, searching for something, pleading, demanding, condemning. She gave him nothing. His body convulsed, legs kicking against the floor, sending the small side table crashing over. The lamp shattered, plunging the room into flickering darkness. The scent of blood thickened in the air, mingling with the waxy fragrance of the burning candle by the fireplace. Loretta watched him struggle, his strength waning, the fight slipping from his limbs. The years of control, of cruelty, unraveled in mere seconds. Then she struck again. The second thrust sent him collapsing fully onto the floor, his breath wheezing, red soaking into his pristine white shirt. She knelt beside him, the knife still in her grip, her hands slick with warmth. The air was thick with the metallic scent of blood, the silence stretching into eternity. The house, which had once echoed with his voice, now held nothing but his dying breaths. For the first time in years, she felt no fear. The sound of soft footsteps startled her, and she turned to see Nia standing in the doorway. Her daughter's face was pale, her eyes locked onto the crumpled figure on the floor. The silence between them was deafening. Nia's chest rose and fell in shallow, quick breaths, her body rigid with shock. Then Nia opened her mouth, and a scream tore through the house. The sharp knock at the door followed almost immediately. Neighbors. Loretta didn't move. She sat there, breathing heavily, staring at the lifeless form of Edward Hayes, his legacy spilling across the wooden floor. Loretta's arrest sent shockwaves through the city. The news spread like wildfire, filling headlines with words that painted her as a cold-blooded murderer, a woman who had taken the life of a beloved spiritual leader in an act of savage violence. Pastor Edward Hayes was mourned as a saint, a man devoted to his faith and his congregation, a pillar of the community. His image, carefully cultivated over years of sermons and charity work, was preserved in glowing tributes. His face appeared on the front pages of newspapers, his name spoken with reverence in hushed tones at church gatherings. Candles were lit in his honor, vigils held outside the church where he had preached for decades. No one wanted to hear another version of the story. Loretta was led from her home in handcuffs, her nightgown stained with blood, her expression vacant. Flashing red and blue lights painted the street outside her home, illuminating the sea of faces that had gathered to watch. Neighbors stood on their porches, whispering, shaking their heads. Some clutched their Bibles, murmuring prayers. Others called out in anger, condemning her before she had even stepped inside a courtroom. She did not resist. She did not speak. The trial was swift. The prosecution built a narrative that was both simple and devastating. They painted Loretta as a woman consumed by jealousy, a wife whose bitterness had turned to rage, leading her to kill her husband in cold blood. They spoke of Edward's reputation, his charity, his unwavering dedication to the church. Witnesses were called to testify to his kindness, his generosity, his role as a mentor to young men in the congregation. Videos of his past sermons were played before the jury, reinforcing the image of a man who had spent his life in service to others. Loretta's defense was weak. There were whispers of abuse, mentions of the unbearable control he exerted over his household. But the stories were vague, unsupported. There were no police reports, no official complaints. No one had ever seen a bruise, heard a cry for help. She had suffered in silence, and now that silence condemned her. The truth about Nia remained buried. When the pregnancy was brought up, the courtroom shifted. Some murmured in sympathy, but most dismissed it as an attempt to tarnish Edward's legacy. The prosecution countered with speculation. Perhaps the child belonged to a boy from school, perhaps it was the result of a secret relationship Nia had hidden from her mother. No one wanted to believe that the man they had idolized was capable of such betrayal. No one wanted to imagine that behind the pulpit, behind the scripture, there had been something monstrous. Nia was not called to testify. The judge deemed her too fragile, too vulnerable to withstand questioning. She had been taken in by distant relatives, hidden away from the media storm. Loretta sat in the defendant's chair, staring ahead as the jury delivered its verdict. Guilty. Premeditated murder. The sentence was life in prison. There was no outcry from the public, no protests on her behalf. To the world, justice had been served. The monster had been punished. The saint had been avenged. After the sentencing, Loretta was led away in silence. She did not cry. She did not plead. There was nothing left to say. Meanwhile, Nia gave birth alone. She was young, too young, and yet she bore the weight of her child with a quiet acceptance. The city turned its back on her. In the eyes of the congregation, she carried the sin of her mother and the disgrace of her own existence. She left Memphis with the baby, taking only what little she had. No destination, no plan, only the need to escape the whispers, the looks of disgust, the constant reminder of everything that had been taken from her. She never spoke of Edward Hayes again. But every time she looked at her child, she saw him. His face, his blood, his legacy, forever etched into the one thing she could never escape. 20 years had passed. Time had moved forward, indifferent to the wreckage it left behind. The city of Memphis had changed, but the name Edward Hayes still carried weight. His image remained frozen in the memories of those who had revered him. His sermons were still quoted, his lessons spoken with reverence. The church had erected a marble monument in his honor, a statue standing tall in the courtyard, inscribed with words about faith, sacrifice, and the power of redemption. To those who passed by, he was a martyr, a man who had been taken too soon by the violent hands of an unhinged woman. His story was repeated in sermons, his legacy preserved in books and speeches, a cautionary tale about the dangers of evil masquerading as love. No one spoke of Loretta Jameson anymore. She had been forgotten, buried beneath the weight of her crime, lost in the routine of prison life. The walls of her cell had become her world, the rigid schedule of confinement her only sense of time. Mornings began with metallic clangs of doors unlocking, afternoons passed in silence or in the low hum of voices discussing nothing that mattered. Nights stretched long and empty. The days blurred into each other, the years passing with a dull inevitability. There were no visitors. No letters. No reminders of the life she once had. She had aged inside those walls, her body growing thinner, her face marked by lines deeper than her years should have allowed. The fire that once burned in her had long been extinguished. She no longer asked for justice, no longer hoped for anything beyond the quiet inevitability of the end. She did not pray for forgiveness because she knew none would come. Nia had never come. Far from Memphis, in a town where no one knew her name, Nia had built a life of her own. She had raised her son alone, giving him a home that was simple, stable, unremarkable. She worked hard, stayed out of sight, and never spoke of the past. She had changed her last name, severed all ties to the city that had cast her aside. There was no trace of Edward Hayes in her life, at least, not one that could be seen. But the past had never truly left her. Every night, she looked at her son and wondered. His features were his own, but sometimes, in the right light, she saw something else in him, something familiar, something inherited. She watched the way he moved, the way his eyes darkened when he was deep in thought, and she felt the cold grip of fear curl around her spine. Was he innocent, untouched by the horrors of his lineage? Or did the blood of his father carry a darkness that had yet to surface? She loved him, but she feared him. And for that, she hated herself. The news of Loretta's death arrived on a gray morning, delivered in an unassuming envelope. A simple notice, official and devoid of emotion, informing her that her mother had died in her sleep. No details, no explanations, just a confirmation of what had always been inevitable. She sat at her kitchen table, staring at the paper until the words blurred. She had not spoken to her mother in 2 decades. She had told herself that it was better this way, that the distance was necessary, that she had nothing left to say. She had convinced herself that she felt nothing, that the past was sealed behind her. But for the first time in 20 years, she cried. It was not a loud, wailing grief, not the kind that demanded to be heard. It was quiet, restrained, the kind of sorrow that had been waiting in the shadows for far too long. She cried for the woman her mother had once been, for the life that had been stolen from both of them, for the forgiveness she had never been able to offer. She cried for the years that had been lost, for the love that had never been spoken aloud, for the silence that had stretched too long between them. But forgiveness had come too late. Outside, her son played in the yard, his laughter echoing in the crisp morning air. She wiped her face quickly, afraid that he might see her like this, afraid of what he might ask. The past was dead, she reminded herself. It had to be. But as she folded the letter and placed it in a drawer, she knew that no matter how far she ran, it would never truly leave her.